Good evening, friends. I welcome you to the very first episode of this financial year. And what a way to begin this journey. We have with us a power trio. Dr. Kavita Ranganathan, Professor for Finance and Strategy at TAPME. She's also a visiting research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development at Berlin. She has prior work experience at NISM and has been part of the research team for Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission of the Ministry of Finance, Government of India. She's joined today by Amit Trivedi, noted trainer and author. Amit has conducted several workshops across the country and has trained more than 64,000 participants till date. Amit has also contributed his knowledge in mainstream media and has more than 440 articles published under his name. He's also a renowned author and has 4 books to his credit. To complete this trio, we have none other than Mr. K.S. Rao, Senior Vice President and Head of Distributor Development and Investor Education at Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund. At ABSLMF, he has spearheaded the mission of financial literacy and investor education, reaching out to various demographic segments across the country to help inculcate savings as a habit. He's been instrumental in developing path-breaking modules such as My First Paycheck, Money Lab, Nivesh Mahakumbh, and Samriddhi, just to name a few. He is an alumnus of IIM Calcutta and holds a master's degree in business administration, majoring in finance. Mr. Rao has been instrumental in ABSLMF bagging several international and domestic accolades in the space of investor education and distribution development. Just recently, Mr. Rao has won the Business Leader of the Year, Invest Mutual Fund in Investor Education, and the Asia Asset Management Award for Investor Education. This powerful trio today is going to share the insights on how we can identify and manage our clients' common biases that keep them away from wealth creation. Over to you, Mr. Rao. I'm excited to hear all three of you.
Anita, thanks a lot, and thanks to the entire team of Cafe Mutual. And indeed, good evening and welcome Amit ji and Dr. Kavita. And good evening to each one of you. Thank you so much for making your time. I trust each one of you are doing well. It's like this is a time of Corona once again. I mean, I'm sure you are taking utmost care of you and your loved ones. Thanks to each one of you. Probably some of you were there in the last 4 days in the first program of the year when we started the certification on life planning, which we promised earlier at a Cafe Mutual. And this is the 11th session which we are doing with learning from the masters. And Amit ji is back. He was the one at the second session with the succession planning. Today we are back. And today it's going to be a very interesting topic. It is decoding investor psychology. It is a DIP. This taking a dip on investor psychology. What is this DIP? I used to tell earlier when in our Nivesh Mahakumbh, we used to invite people, and I used to work with many of MFDs across the country. And when I go to, like, for example, if I'm in Indore and all the MFDs are around, and we say, we all invite you to take a dip in this Mahakumbh. And there in this dip, you don't need to get, drowned into the water, but you need to understand DIP. That is, DIP is an acronym which we used to call D for delayed gratification, I for impact of inflation, and P is the power of compounding. Probably the dip is true for the investor psychology. Let us understand what is that dip and let us go forward. I think behavioral finance in the over last 1 decade, it has become one of the exciting field to understand. And classic economic theory always says that people think perfectly rational. And but we have seen many occasions people don't think rational, and it's like one of such things could be 2000 tech stock boom, or as latest as last year, when markets were getting down, people were getting out, and it's like why it has happened, what it has happened. That was the case. Probably it is goes back to the Nobel Prize of 2002, Daniel Kahneman, when he is talking about who's popularized behavioral finance. Today we will understand, and we have a professor with us who did a lot of research around, and we can put a lot of questions to her. And we have our own good friend Amit understands how it can be good on the advisor's perspective. And what is that as an advisor, how I need to understand the behavioral finance. And this is one area of personal finance which will make us very fascinating. If I understand investor rightly, probably it is not that I need to understand the markets, but I need to understand the investor and investor behavior. that makes all that happening. I mean, all that we can do it. And MFDs and RIAs can together, together decode investor psychology better. And once you decode manage emotions better. And with this, I start with Dr. Kavita. I think, to get a brief here, Dr. Kavita, as I briefed today at a Cafe Mutual, we have many of them are MFDs and RAs who interact with hundreds, thousands of people. And earlier you worked with NISM and you understand the whole perspective of the business. And you did a lot of research work and you are hands-on to it. Can you explain, can you narrate and, to take a brief to us, what is the role of these emotions in the financial well-being and your perspective, what it can be?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rao, and I'm very happy to join this panel again. Good evening, Mr. Amit, and all the MFTs and RIs out there. Thank you to Cafe Mutual and to Aditya Birla to combine and basically, it's a very interesting session, and I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to learn actually from all of you. So the question that you said basically on emotions in decision making, again, let's take a step back and try and understand what do we think about emotion. So suppose the word emotion comes to us, how do we react? So generally we have been the way we perceive emotions is that it's extremely it's kind of reckless kind of a behavior, right? And we think that to be emotional means to be irrational. I mean, that's the first kind of understanding that we have about emotions, right? But if you remove emotions from human beings, how we would, most of us would be reduced to what we would imagine as robots. There'll be no fun in life actually, right? To make decisions without emotions. And in fact, maybe we wouldn't be able to go around making decisions even without emotions. So to begin with, I think emotions and human behavior, it goes hand in hand. We cannot perform without emotions. But having said that, the way the research looks at emotions is that it's natural to our decision making process. So we shouldn't shun it. We should basically try to understand what kind of emotions help us aid in our decision making, and what are the kind of emotions which we should basically keep it at bay, right? So let me refer to one research over here, which kind of segregates emotions into two kinds. So one is basically integral to the decision making process. They say it's called integral emotions, and the other is basically what is called as incidental emotions. So let's take an example. So suppose there are two people and they go to a shop to buy a smartphone. Both of them are buying a really pricey smartphone, and the shopkeeper offers both of them an insurance for the smartphone, right? So this person B, he is buying the smartphone, basically maybe his grandmother has given him this money, or it's perhaps his first salary, and he's using that to buy a smartphone. So he is emotionally attached to the phone, right? Now the way, if you look at it, the risks that both of them, like something would happen to the phone, or the money that both of them would be spending towards the phone is kind of the same, right? But because this person B is emotionally attached to the phone, it becomes even more important for him to basically take that insurance, right? And if tomorrow something happens to the phone, this person B is going to be much more hurt than person A, right? So this is an example of an integral emotion. So this integral emotion is basically part of the decision making process. It creates dilemmas for us in the decision making process, and we have to listen carefully to this emotion, right? Now let's look at what is incidental emotion. So imagine you had a bad day at work, or your favorite pet is sick, or it's just that all those bad things that happen to us in our day to day activities, and we carry them when we make decisions. I mean, these are certain emotions maybe we should try and keep it at bay, because we know that these kind of emotions might influence, and we might not, in that state, we might not be able to make the right decision. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, generally what happens is, even in like behavioral finance, the perception is emotions are bad. But the fact is, we cannot function without these emotions, right? Emotions actually define us. So one is, I would say, emotions, and it's not like bad or good. We have to recognize the right kind of emotions, which helps our decision making and kind of, go with the flow.
Thank you so much. Shall I take it forward?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Thank you so much, Kavita. It's very nicely put with the integral and incidental. And with this, I'll move to you, Amit. That's like you spoke in your book many a times, and I remember I don't want to ask Kavita today on biases, which the word she doesn't like, and I will take those emotions and how it can go on. And can you highlight when she said about emotions? Nothing we can't there is no emotion good or bad, but how you can use all that you need to understand. I think in your book you have mentioned investment is not a number game, but it is a mind game.
Yeah.
And please highlight some of these common emotions. And for you, I can use the word biases, not with Dr. Kavita, and how these biases can impact our financial decisions, and what are the potential negative impact of these, where advisors need to know. It's like, I mean, sometimes it's as an advisor, I need to understand, I need to understand my own emotions. I need to understand my customer, my investor emotions, and what is that it can do. I mean, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a very interesting question, and I'll take from where Dr. Kavita left. So while emotions are neither good nor bad, they are there. So emotions exist. That's number one. Number two, let's take an example which is closer home to all the mutual fund distributors and registered investment advisors. And then I'll go to the old world. So let's say there is an application form for a mutual fund. And when the customer signs that form, at that moment, the evaluation is over whether to fear the decision, consequences of the decision, or trust the decision that one is taking. And that itself is emotion. Because as Dr. Kavita was mentioning, if we wait for all the information to arrive at a decision, number one, we could either be robots, or number two, because not every single piece of information is available to anybody at any point in time, we will be frozen and will not be able to take a decision. So one of the two things would happen. From that point of view, let's look at some of the instances where the emotions can have some role to play. There could be some biases which could be harmful to us. And one of the biases is overconfidence. And that overconfidence is something that I'm really concerned about as of today as we speak, because last year some of the investors invested. We know the story of a large number of new Demat accounts which were opened. I was talking to my daughter's friends, and they opened their accounts, and they are still in college. They opened their trading account. Now it's interesting. None of them used the word they opened their investment account. All of them said they opened a trading account. Look at the play of words. Now, after putting their money, they saw profits. And this profit was on the account of the massive rally that we saw in the markets. And that massive rally was the result of liquidity flooded by the central banks across the world. And that was a result of that was a response to the pandemic situation and the lockdown. Now, in such a case, a youngster who's putting the money for the first time and taking all the credit for the profits is going to feel overconfident. And there is a very thin line between overconfidence and arrogance. And after that, caution is thrown to the winds. So this is one factor that people should be wary of. When you're making profits, be wary of the overconfidence bias. But on the other hand, when you are losing money or when the markets are falling, there is a fear that sets in. And that's the other side of bias. Now, a lot of discussions have also happened on the fear on the other side, which is called the FOMO, fear of missing out. So in other ways, one can say that we are only swinging between FOLO and FOMO, fear of losing out and fear of missing out. So either we are worried about the losses and we end up taking wrong decisions of getting out at the wrong time, or we become overconfident and end up putting more money when the prices are already high. And sometimes that overconfidence also leads to leveraging, and we borrow money and invest further, only increasing the level of risk. In either case, somebody is only a victim of the emotional pool rather than taking a rational decision. These are two very, very strong biases that I would request every MFD, every advisor to keep in mind while talking to the clients. Now, let's look at the advisors or MFD's bias. Can the MFD or the advisor also become fearful? Can the MFD or the investment advisor also become overconfident? Yes, it does happen. If my advice turned out to be true and the client is making money, there is a temptation to take the credit. But when the advice turns out to be wrong for an unknown reason, external factor, I never want to take the blame. Now, this is also an emotional response to the situation. And these are some of the examples that I'm referring to, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amit. It's very interesting. And these biases, I used to call these are the two ozones. I mean, one is the optimism, second is the overconfidence. And you are either over optimistic and you are overconfident, and you pay a price for it. And most of the times, financial advisors are they are the, like, I think in this book, Nudge, Richard Thaler talks about choice architects. And when you are a choice architect, you need to understand this. And, this is the responsibility. Coming back to you, Kavita, I think it's very interestingly you have narrated the example of the mobile phone. But when it comes to these behavioral biases, like even the knowledgeable ones will take this. They commit the mistakes, and it's like I think it's we said this Benjamin Graham. It's investor's chief problem is and his worst enemy is he himself. And
Yes.
can you narrate some of those mistakes we take during relating to the money decisions, and how we need to aware, because most of us, we are here, most of them are advisors, and if we are aware, I mean, of course we would have read certain things, we are aware of part of things, but I love in this book Morgan Housel we quoted, and money belief is the money relies more on the psychology than the finance. But what are those mistakes people will do?
Okay,
It's
so let me speak from one area because I think the time is limited today. A kind of area that I do research on, which is basically about how people perceive risks. So currently we are doing a study on how investment professionals perceive risk. I can't speak about the results yet because uh, uh, we don't have a clearer set of results now, but I'll just give you an intuition of what we find and what basically, the literature here is. So basically, so there's another paper, a recent paper, which is published in like a top journal, where they do this very interesting experiment. So what they do is, this is basically done with investment professionals from around the world. They surveyed around 3,000 investment professionals, and they also surveyed common investors about how they perceive risks. So what they do in this experiment is they provide 9 different types of distributions. So graphs, right? So like suppose, you open a mutual fund brochure, or, you open any of these information booklets, the first thing that comes to us is an average, right? So the mean return is basically published, right? And so if I may ask you all this question, how do we interpret this information called as an average? So suppose, you say that last 3 year CAGR is say, 12%, 15%. What sense can we make out of it? So the question that these researchers also pose is, how can we interpret an average when we don't know the standard deviation? Number one. Okay. So without the standard deviation, you would not be able to understand the distribution. So this research paper, what they did is they provided averages and standard deviations, and they asked professional investors. They gave them 9 different asset classes with these graphs, nice graphs, and it was basically very interactive and everything. And they simply asked these investment professionals, how do you perceive which of these 9 different asset classes you think is risky, right? But unfortunately, like people were not able to correctly assess risk, even by using averages and standard deviation. Then what they did is they basically what we call as the third moment and fourth moment. So basically they gave dispersion. Then they finally gave skewness. So they made the distribution such that the respondents could see the skewness. That is when they found out that investment professionals are able to assess the risk of these asset classes better than common investors. Even then common investors were not able to make the difference between these risks. So again, going back to this, to your question, I'm not sure about mistakes. Okay, but I think what I have learned, and this has been kind of a burning question for me as well, is that I think finance is an extremely dynamic world, right? We have a huge information overload, and I think there is an a more fundamental problem of what we call as literacy, whether it is risk literacy, financial literacy, and I think that is something that can be fixed, right? Okay, emotions is one another thing which is very important, right? We will talk about it, but I think before that, statistical literacy, because we depend on these statistics when we communicate risks either to our clients, or the way these are the statistics that regulators use to communicate to us, right? So we use it all the time. So I think the first fix, if at all you're talking about mistakes, right? I think the first fix that has to be done is towards the statistical, is towards asking this question: how do people perceive risks? What are the different ways we should communicate so that risks are better communicated to our clients, or the other industry or whatever it is? Yeah,
Just
over
to
to you.
just to add
Yeah.
just to add to what Kavita was mentioning, Rao sir, many MFD friends have expressed this. While traveling across the country, they've shared this with me, that when you tell a person that expect 12% per annum
Right.
return over a 10 to 15-year period, the way they perceive it, and somebody broke it down beautifully. The way that common clients, retail investors perceive is, I am supposed to get 12% every year, and that also means I'm supposed to get 1% every month. Yeah, so the understanding of dispersion, understanding of standard deviation is something that is required. Otherwise, the common sense simply divides the numbers and arrives at conclusions.
Yeah, I think fantastic. Very nicely put, Amit. I mean, you can't get a better answer than, when we are talking, people will listen what they want to listen, and that's where the question comes. Probably here I go back to Dr. Kavita once again. You spoke about the risks, and you spoke about the understanding of the risk. I remember that survey. Even I myself have undergone to that survey which you shared earlier. And here the problem comes. I have seen from the investor angle, especially on the MFDs and the conversations. Investor risk perception itself undergoes changes with the market conditions. Like,
Absolutely.
his ability to risk, like for example, index is at 50, every day it is going up, then his ability to take risk, it appears it's fantastic. And when market goes down, his ability will come down. How do we establish to clearly evaluate the risk while taking the investment? I mean, one more, I think, Amit suggests in practice management sessions is, you can have an investment policy statement, so that, we can say on this day how we are presuming the risks. Do you suggest anything, any statistical evidence?
Right. Okay. So let me refer to another piece of work, which is called as a behavioral portfolio. So the whole idea of this piece of work is, generally when we teach portfolio theory also, so we basically are used to, creating one big portfolio for the client, right? And so what happens with this one big portfolio is you have different goals, and then for all of these goals, you elicit one risk, right? And then you basically, based on that your level of risk, you decide your asset allocation, and so on and so forth, right? So there is one piece of work which says that, okay, let me ask you this question before I introduce you to the piece of work. So suppose you want to buy this, expensive, I don't know, piece of clothing, like a nice jacket, or beautiful sari, right? You have been eyeing that and you want to buy it. And then you basically get a salary, you get your salary, you get an income tax rebate, right? The IT department is is good to you, or you basically get a lottery, right? Which of this you would use to basically buy that, that piece of article, that what you have been really wanting to buy for a long time, right? So when we ask this question, and this is a very popular question on mental accounting, so generally, people will say, "Oh, I got a lottery. I basically use my lottery, right? I got an income tax rebate." So very few people say that they would use their salary. So the question to ask here is, when the money goes into your checking account, it does not say, "I'm coming from salary. I'm coming from income tax rebate," right? So money is fungible, but right, so that is what rational theory says. Why are you making these different kinds of buckets in your mind? But we are normal people, right? We associate money with the source of where it comes from, and that's where our emotions kind of speak. So these researchers, Hersh Sheffrin and Meir Stackman, so what they said is, yes, mental accounting is a very well-known phenomena. It's considered a bias, by the way. Okay, so it's basically it's an extremely well-known phenomena, and it's very well documented. Everywhere you go, there are lots of experiments done which document mental accounting. Now, so what? So what they did is, let us use that bias to the advantage. Now you know that people have exhibit mental accounting. You can't train them and tell them, don't have mental accounting. That would be very difficult. It would take a lot of time. So rather, you use that bias and basically create something for your client. So what they did is, rather than creating one big portfolio, they created portfolio for different goals, right? So suppose your goal is your daughter's wedding, right? And you want to, 10 years from now, you want money for that. You want to basically, develop a corpus for that, right? The way you will approach that goal and the risk that you have towards that goal would be very different than if your goal was to basically go for a vacation, right? So it's very important that I'm sure all of you already do it, this goal-based investing. But the point is to elicit risk. It might be a little more cumbersome, but the point is to basically elicit risk for each of this goal. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think we slowly get into this discussion. How do we elicit risk, right? So there are so many surveys out there, and people spend like half an hour, 1 hour, they give all kind of information, and then something gets thrown out, and then there's a number which gets thrown out, and then you use that number for your asset allocation and all. But I think it's time to like take a step back and ask this question: what is it that hurts our client the most? And we actually ran this experiment with when I was at an ISM, and we found that it is the losses. Basically, irrespective of anything, right? It is the loss which hurts the most, right? So, and each of us have our kind of acceptance to loss. So, suppose I invest 100,000 rupees, I might have acceptance of only 20,000 rupees for a loss, right? And basically, the more risk you take, the more return you can expect, right? So I think it's important to maybe devise, come out with risk elicitation tools which are much simpler, and which basically have this critical information, right? Which clients also can, kind of attach and can understand better. and and maybe that would help us. The question that you asked, that markets go up and down, so what do we do? But if we really understand what is it that hurts the client, and we elicit risk based on that component, maybe I think we would be able to speak better to them.
I think it's very interesting. I used to put it in an acronym. When I used to talk to our advisors and investors, and the investors per se, I always used to say, you are all LIC biased, not about life insurance corporation, but
Yeah.
L is loss aversion, I is an
Okay.
impatience, and C is a conservatism. And most of the times they never used to invest money in the equity also. Then how you need to get out of LIC and come back to the equities, come back to the advisor and stay with an advisor.
Yeah.
So,
So just referring to the point that you made, like about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, because of that only behavioral economics and finance became popular. We are accepted in mainstream finance thanks to Kahneman and Tversky. And they kind of coined this word. So they say people are not like, okay, risk aversion is something, but people are mostly loss averse.
Loss averse.
And it's important to, kind of understand that how much loss averse are you?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And with you, Amit, I'll go back to you. And this
Sure.
is a MFD perspective because you work with day in, day out with MFDs and RIAs. And what is that about MFDs need to understand about the investment risk? Not that they are not aware of it, but what are those basic things, what they need to aware and how they need to go back and nudge the investors? I think here the nudge is the most important part of it. Can you suggest something?
So first of all, sir, I'm not going to say which are the risks and what do they mean. I mean, people know about it. But the one thing that I would say is that risk is important for the MFDs and RIAs, because if there is no risk, then MFDs and RIAs are not required. So it is the very reason of our existence. Yeah. So the moment we now look at it that way, then at least we are calmed down. What I've done is one sort of a nudge. Something that I was fearing, I'm saying don't fear that. That is the reason for my existence. Now I'm less likely to be afraid of it. Number two, as far as investors are concerned, if we broadly look at the investment risks, then there are, and then this is exactly what I say in some of the investor awareness programs also, that number one, you have volatility risk. Number two, you got credit risk. Number three, you got risk of illiquidity. Now, somebody comes and says, I am risk averse and I don't want any risk at all. Tell me one instrument where all the three are absent. Where do you keep your money so that there is no volatility, no credit risk, no illiquidity, or full liquidity is available? The only place is keep it under the carpet at home. And when you do that, of course, I'm not even getting into the risk of theft or demonetization, but you lose out the value of that currency against inflation, which is the fourth risk. So essentially, if you want anything more than inflation, then you have to take one or more among the three risks. If I put it this way, then risk is not to be afraid of, risk is a choice. Incidentally, I wrote an article a few years back, maybe 7-8 years back, where I'd written that in the mutual funds, it is mandatory to write mutual fund investments are subject to market risk. The regulator should actually extend it to all the instruments and simply make it mandatory to write that all investments are subject to some risks. Please understand the risk before signing the check. That should be a mandatory statement. The moment you do it that way, then people also would start accepting. And if it's a choice, now you to choose which risks you want to take and how much. So let me just give a story or two in how do you nudge people. So first of all, let's say equity markets are volatile, and as Kavita was rightly mentioning, people are actually loss averse, not just risk averse. And if they are loss averse, what are they fearing? Equity means losses. Now, if equity means losses, how do I tell them that in fixed income also there is a potential loss? I don't want to scare anybody. So I used to say, let's say there are two instruments available. In one case, over a 5-year period, your 100 can become 80, or your 100 can become 150, or your 100 can become 200. Which one would you pick? Sorry. One is where the possibility number one is your 100 can become 80 or your 100 can become 200. In another case, over a 5-year of time, your 100 would become 140. Which one would you choose? And majority of people choose option number 2. Then I turn it around and say, now you've got 2 more choices. Or rather, the first 2 choices are not available, the next 2 choices. Choice number 1, your 100 can become 50, or your 100 can become 150. Choice number 2, your 100 will become 95 at the end of 5 years. Which one will you pick up? And a much larger percentage of people pick up the one with larger variability of returns. all I've done is I've adjusted the returns for inflation, nothing else. The moment you put it in a different perspective, people start to look at it differently. Another example which I borrow from Nick Murray, he says, when people come to me and say that I am a conservative investor, I would say, welcome, even I am a conservative investor. And I've not met any individual who's not a conservative investor. But let us decide what you want to conserve. Do you want to conserve the principal value of your investment or the purchasing power of your investment? And then the discussion starts. Now you got a launch pad to talk about basic investment pitch that you have, inflation, the volatility risk, and what not. So these are the nudges where you open the mind, it's a spark, and then carry the discussion forward.
Fabulous, Amit. You're always good at giving those nudges, which are very practical to any of the MFDs or RIs to use. But now it comes for most of us. We are so busy, we are so engulfed. We see mutual funds, the moment they publish the fact sheets, or there is an article which comes in either Morningstar or Cafe Mutual or somewhere, we are always busy in studying and how something is beating the market. I think beating the market is the responsibility of the fund manager, and we are worried about it. And the job of us as an advisor is beating our own, beating ourselves. That is the emotions. And I don't want to ask this question to Kavita because she's against biases. What are the biases MFDs and RIS they carry for themselves? I'm not against anybody of the MFDs, but we need to aware of it. I have this bias, and if I'm having the bias, is fine. If bias is having me, then the problem comes. And what are the biases MFDs are?
I think almost everywhere we are seeking certainty, and that seeking certainty means when somebody is expected to beat the benchmark indices, then we want that person to beat the benchmark indices at all points in time. That's seeking certainty, according to me. And I'll just take this discussion to the current situation of the vaccine. I went for the vaccination a few days back, and before I was going, a friend asked me, which vaccine are you going to take? I said, whatever the doctor administers. I'm not going to ask. He said, why? This vaccine has so much efficacy and versus the other one has a lower efficacy. I said, yes, I have read those kind of things. I'm not an expert on the subject, but tell me, a 60% efficacy versus a 80% efficacy, both are higher than 0% efficacy, which is not taking the vaccine at all. Now, translate it to the world of investing. What choice do I have? I have X fund manager and Y fund manager or the index. Incidentally, the choice that I have is by investing my money myself or buying an index fund or investing with X fund manager or investing with Y fund manager. And in almost all cases, the X fund manager, Y fund manager or index are going to beat me hands down. Simply because this is not my area of expertise. This is not an area where I have the luxury of devoting enough time. So in the absence of expertise and in the absence of time, how do I expect to beat the pros at the game? So rather than focusing too much on who beats the indices, I would rather say, if this person can beat me, I'm already better off. Yes, I'm not saying that you don't do your analysis in selecting which fund to buy or not, but don't regret in case sometimes the decision goes wrong. And educate your clients accordingly, that while we'll take due care to ensure, and this is where, now you talked about IPS, there's another thing that would be important is, do you have your fund selection methodology? On what basis do you shortlist the schemes that you are recommending to your clients? If you have a written methodology, you can actually take the client through that and say, we've gone through this, and based on that, we've recommended or we've sold these funds to you. Add to that the investment policy statement and the IPS also. Let's say you decided that any individual client's exposure to a single scheme will not exceed 20% of the portfolio. You can put all those limits, and 20% is just an arbitrary number. It is up to each MFD and RIA to decide. But once you've done those things, then many of these biases can be eliminated, because the fund manager being able to beat the indices, yeah, this is what we expect. And you got all the right to question the fund manager on why one is beating, why one is not beating. You got all the right, please do the due diligence. But that cannot be the deal breaker.
Great. Fantastic. It's always probably, I agree with you on that confirmation bias. And, sometimes I have seen, it's not that I'm generalizing or rationalizing. It's either you have a confirmation bias, or you have a cognitive dissonance, or you have a recency bias. And so most of the times we go by the recency bias, because we just see the, something has come and there is a comparison. Somebody has outperformed, then my fund has not performed. Then we go back. Maybe after 1 year, everyone will come to the same, then each of us, if we can assess, we are there. But now coming back to you, Dr. Kavita, it's like we have, as an RIA, as an MFD, our responsibility is to handle not only my emotions, but I need to handle the emotions of manage the emotions. If not, the handling is not the right word, manage the emotions of the investors, clients. How do they need to do it? I think before you answer the question, my request with all the audience is, any questions, you can put it on the Q&A box or chat box. We can take as many questions as possible from both of them. And in the process, if anyone would like to have a dialogue and speak up, you can raise the hand. Probably you can have a conversation directly that can give little more comfort. Please feel free. And over to you, Dr. Kavita.
Okay, so the way I understand your question is, how do we manage our clients' emotions? Am I right?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So one is like how I began, like how I said earlier. I think it's important to understand whether the emotion is coming from the decision process itself, or is the emotion that the client is, showcasing, is it incidental? Right. Of course, that means that you need to speak to your client you have to be like a doctor to your client. So in the literature, it's called financial doctors, advisors, and they're basically financial doctors. So once you get to know whether it is incidental or whether it is integral, you would be able to use some tools and basically try and kind of soothe these kind of emotions. So also in the literature, so now I'm going to use the word bias. So basically the literature says that the other way to look at biases is to identify whether it is a cognitive bias or whether it is an emotional bias. For example, a cognitive bias basically comes from information processing difficulty. For example, like an anchoring bias, right? So classic example is that when IPOs take off, right? On the first day, generally there is a pop, right? So many investors, and why is a pop? Largely because of the demand that has been created in the pre-market, right? All of that basically flows in the aftermarket, and then the stock price goes up. But many investors anchor to that price, and they keep holding their stock. And basically, so if the price falls down after say a week or 2 weeks, or in the month, they keep anchoring to that price that happened, the high price on the first day, and they are unwilling to sell their stock, right? So this is a classic case of an anchoring bias. But it's basically to make the investor understand why has this price risen. It's not about the valuation of the IPO, but basically there has been an excess demand which has pushed up the price on the first day. So the point that I'm trying to make is this is an example of a cognitive bias, where you can speak to your investor. Maybe it stems from literacy problems. You can speak to your investor, and you can basically kind of make them understand that there is the other view, and so maybe your investor would get de-biased. Okay. Now, the other kind of bias which we have been discussing earlier is known as the emotional bias. Now, emotional bias is regret, disappointment, loss aversion, right? All of these are emotional biases. It's practical, and you have to be a very trained psychologist if you have to teach your client how to not feel regret or not feel disappointed. So there's a very nice tool which is proposed by Michael Pompey, And basically what he says is, if your client exhibits a cognitive bias, then you can moderate it. You can moderate as in you can teach or de-bias it. You can try to do that. Invest your time into do that, right? But if your client exhibits an emotional bias or exhibits, for example, loss aversion, then there is no point, pushing him to take risks, right? Which basically goes beyond his aversion to, to accept the loss, right? So what do you do at that point of time? You adapt to your client's biases, right? So this could be one example. So of course, all of this means that we need to first understand this literature on biases and try to understand, or come out with what is a cognitive bias, what is an emotional bias. I think that's a conversation I was having with Mr. Amit, that if there are any nice examples which is pertinent to the Indian industry, because these examples are there, which is very American, right? So we have different culture, and the way we see things are very different. So it means it's a lot of scope for work to understand, and this kind of information, anecdotal evidences, can actually come from professionals, right? And suppose this literature can be created as to what is cognitive bias, what is an emotional bias, and of course then the tool is going to be the same. Like it's common sense. You teach your clients to moderate their cognitive bias, and you adapt to their emotional biases.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
so
that's
much.
Just to, add to that, what matrix that Kavita was referring to, if I can just share it on the screen for a couple of moments.
yes, that would be great.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, there it goes.
So yeah, so what this basically says is, so this is by Michael Pompane, and this is part of this literature by the CFA Society on Risk Profiling. So what this basically says is, it's important to look at the biases through the lens of wealth. So you see here, when you see here, so a client who's high wealth and kind of exhibits cognitive biases, right? You use moderation as well as adaptation. Why? Because he's still high wealth, right? I mean, I think I would hear this from you, that it's really difficult to convince the HNIs, right? So, but whereas if you look at this here, the client is low wealth and he has cognitive bias, right? There is no point. You can't have the scope of letting him or her go with the bias, because it's going to, tomorrow they may not have basically money to survive, right? So survival is a problem here. So by all means, this client has to be moderated, right? But the same thing, so a client with low wealth, emotional bias, try to moderate. If that doesn't work, then you basically use adaptation, right? And here, client with high wealth, emotional bias, you obviously you can't do much. You have to adapt. So the other example that I gave, where you basically build portfolios, build portfolios for the goals, and you elicit their risk for each of their goals, is a classic case of adapting to their to basically the risk that they exhibit towards that particular goal. So if the goal is very emotional and the client is loss averse, which means he comes in this quadrant, then you know that you have to adapt to his bias, right? But if the goal is cognitive, right, and if the bias is cognitive and the goal is, it's okay, right? Like for example, 3 years from now you want to go for a vacation, right? So in that situation, then you basically use moderation.
Fabulous. I think this is an amazing tool to work on. I think, friends, I would like to brief you, or it's a pleasure to inform. We would like to have a workshop with Dr. Kavita very soon to understand this biases little more deeper. And Dr. Kavita and Amit will join together and we will have a session. I mean, every time at a Cafe Mutual, when we come, we just see the cursory and we want to go deeper, like the way we have just done the life planning workshops for you. And Kavita ji, there is a question coming to you. Now I'll take the audience. This is a question coming from Mr. Amit Merchant. This is a very specific question to request to Kavita ji. One of your statements was create portfolio for different goals. Then question is, if there is one person and say he has multiple goals. When how should one go about risk profiling and product recommendation? Here again, the goals are short term and long term.
Okay, so so this is the literature again from I would like to direct you to the right reference. So it's basically called the Behavioral Portfolio by Stackman and Sheffrin. I can put it in the chat box at some point of time. So what they basically say is, so suppose you have this person and he has different goals. You can kind of like bucket the goals into, say for example, survival, right, or safety, right, and then you can basically have another goal which is like to achieve certain midlife goals, like educating children or buying a house and blah blah blah, right, and then you go on and then you have legacy goals, right, so you basically want to create a corpus, say for your children, and then you have philanthropy goals, right, suppose you want to donate to an NGO, or you have that kind of aspirations, then you also create like you want to generate wealth for that purpose, right? So rather than having a portfolio for every goal, so say children's education, that would make it very cumbersome. Rather, you identify the goals according to the life stages, right, and then you create portfolios for each of these goals. Now, coming to your question on risk elicitation, I don't think there is one tool. So there is so the whole idea is this. I think, again, I think it's very proprietary to have your own risk tool. Correct? I mean, if you can tell me if I'm understanding this in the right way. So every mutual fund manager, or the investment advisor, basically needs to have their own tool, and this is kind of proprietary, right? So one way to think about creating that tool, as I said before, is something that can be used to communicate with your client. For example, the tools that I've seen is quite a lot complex, but if you can use simple tools, right, or simple kind of features which can elicit, say, loss aversion, right, and you can use that tool to elicit risk in each of these goals, and then go about your asset allocation in each of these goals.
Thank you so much. I think, Amit, I'll just come back to you. This question, this is coming from Bhavesh. I mean, probably Kavita's, I'll give a little rest to her. I mean, it's Bhavesh's question is, in bull market, client starts believing that he is smarter than everyone. And we can call it as a overconfidence bias. But how do we manage this emotion bias?
Well, Bhavesh's question seems to be coming from some of the slightly smarter, educated, or wealthier investors, because there are two situations. Why am I mentioning this? Is because when you deal with a certain category of clients, they are likely to take credit of the good and pass on the blame of the bad consequences. Whereas in a lot of cases, the clients feel that it was the advisor who advised right, or the mutual fund distributors who sold the right products, and this is the fruit of that. And in such case, those biases may be a little muted, if not completely absent. So let's come back to the first case. I think at that point in time, there is a very strong emotion that I am successful, I have done this, what was your role? And then at that time you go and say it was not you, somebody else did it. And that's precisely why I said a particular category of clients. So these are smarter, educated, wealthier, these kind of clients, they are less likely to listen when they are successful. So that's not the right time to tell them. You to keep doing this education when the times are good and times are bad.
Right.
Keep telling them about the phases in market, the cycles in market, and he's absolutely bang on. I've actually written this in Riding the Roller Coaster, that in bull market, everybody becomes smart, and in a bear market, everybody becomes wise. Now, how do you counter that? It keeps happening over a period of time, but this is like your SIP in client education. You have to keep doing it irrespective of whether markets are high or low, irrespective of where the client is in the emotional roller coaster, whether the emotions are high or low. You have to keep doing it regularly again and again, and a magic happens.
Thank
The
you.
magic is when you keep telling the client, you start believing that this is the only way markets work. And when your conviction becomes higher, it shows, and the clients would listen to you better.
Fabulous, Amit. I think, it's a behavior reinforced is behavior repeated, right? It is thanks, Bhavesh Sharma. Hope we have answered that. This is coming to you, Dr. Kavita. This is a Shailendra Rajput. How to coach our clients with managing their emotions, especially when there is a volatility in the market. Because on one day there is a positive news and the other day the negative news. The market rallies and market comes down, international and market is down. This leaves investors sometimes clueless how to go about it. How should an advisor respond to this?
Right. So, I mean, I don't have like a tool or something to speak about, but I can tell you some piece of research which kind of says, how can we manage our volatility? So, so apparently, so what happens is we are very reactive to the situation, right? And so if we take ourselves to a future state, right? And we basically are able to view the future state, right? I think the way we will react to this current situation would be very different. Right? So there is this another piece of very interesting work, which kind of, again, this requires the kind of tools or to basically make the client or make the investor see what will happen to their portfolio 5 years from now, right? And the fact that equity markets pay only over the long term will be one way to, kind of convince them that, look here, if you want to be in the equity market, you have to be invested in the long term, and that will basically pay you well. So if I may also, tell you about another nudge, actually, the something that you were asking. So this was done by the US State Department, and so first it was tried out with driving forms. So basically, if you go to a counter and you get a driving form, you fill all the details. At the end of the form, there is a checkbox which says that, in case of undue accident, would you like to donate your organs? So on organ donation, right? So so you have to actively check that box and say that, yes, I would like to donate organs. And we all know that it's a social good and it's very excellent for the society. And how many people die just because they do not get the right organs at the right time, right? So then what happened was, many people used to never check that. It's a kind of a behavior like procrastination, or we don't even think much about it, right? So what the US State Department did is they basically changed the form, and they said that if you don't want to kind of donate your organs, then you have to check. So the default became that you don't want it, right? Of course, it went through a huge kind of, how the United States is that, the freedom and, all of this. So basically they live and breathe those kind of feelings, right? So then what they did was that they basically shifted this to 401k plans, which they have. And the form was basically changed. So the default was, if you don't want to invest in 401k plans, you will have to basically tell the HR department that you're not interested. Otherwise, by default, you basically get invested in certain, in like index funds, for example. Okay, right? So what happened because of this? The investments or the active enrollment into 401k plans basically increased. I think it increased more than 70%, right? So now think about it. Think about the same thing. Now, 5 years from now, you meet the same investor, or 20 years from now, you meet the same investor. 401k is meant for retirement. Will they come and grumble to you and, like kind of say that, oh my God, my wealth has increased in 20 years, which is obvious. But if it is an equity market, it takes long term for, for you to basically experience the gains. So who would complain? Right? So that is a kind of, though the nudge did not work very well for organ donation, I think the nudge worked extremely well when it came to retirement planning.
So I'll share a very relevant example for MFDs in this case.
Yeah.
You may want to design a certain form of your own, or maybe put it in the IPS that the default option is a perpetual SIP increasing year after year. So you do a perpetual top-up SIP. That's the default option. If you want to make any changes, then suggest. Then it's quite likely that a large number of people would accept that default option. And if somebody, otherwise, when I was also working in a mutual fund company, the forms that we had in those days was the SIP for what period. So the period was mentioned as 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, etc., etc. So one of the distributors had come and told me, why don't you change it to perpetual as the option number 1 and then keep reducing it. Don't show the shorter period first. Another example was when I was working in the mutual fund company, one of our star colleagues, he was head of PMS business. So when he would go to the client, and those days the minimum amount for PMS was 25 lakhs. So when the client asked what is the minimum for PMS, many of our team members, we used to tell the minimum amount, which was 25 lakhs. This guy would go and say, sir, for you the minimum is 2 crores. For others we take less. It was a brilliant nudge. We didn't get 2 crores from those investors, but we also never got 25 lakhs. And when we said 25 is the minimum, people would negotiate. Would you take 20? No, he set the anchor at a different level. And these are some of the behavioral nudges that Kavita was also referring to.
I think, thanks to both of you for taking those nudges and a very wonderful examples of either a 401k or this one. In fact, we experimented in few of our SIP applications. When we started the first one, you start earlier, it was 1,000, 2,000. Then we removed that. We started with a large amount and opened with a blank. Exactly. People have invariably ticked the first one, and there your average SIP account has gone up. It's like nudge is always the choice architecture. You drive the person to behave the way you want it to behave. It's I think it's all the communication skills MFD need to develop. And Amitji, this is a question I'll ask you. This is a question coming from Mr. Pramod Naik. Are there any tools that I can utilize while trying to explain the impact of behavioral biases and the benefits of remaining invested as per the investment policy statement to achieve the goals?
I have not come across
probably we can request Dr. Kavita to help us to create some tools for us.
Yeah, but it would be an interesting project because it's a brilliant question. If there are tools available or if there are games available to highlight the negative consequences of the biases, I think that would make a huge difference. What has worked in my case is because I was largely on the sales side and then training side. What has really worked is some small anecdotes or stories where you put it in a different perspective, different manner, and things have changed completely. Take for example, and then sometimes I used to put it in a very lighter manner. Kavita mentioned about the IPOs. So Kavita, I recently came across a guy who invests only in equity IPOs or in mutual funds. This person only invests in ELSS in the month of April, and that's about it. He does not make any other investment. So he's looking at equity IPOs and mutual funds for tax saving. So how do you convince a person like that? So when I used to be in sales, in one of the cases, I had told one person, he said, I only buy NFOs or I only buy IPOs.
Yes.
So I said, yeah, I used to behave in the same manner. And the other day, a new kidney hospital opened in my neighborhood. I went for a dialysis. The guy said, what are you saying? You don't go for a dialysis just because a new hospital is open. I said, exactly. If I need dialysis, I'll go to an old hospital also or a new hospital. Similarly, if you need to invest, it doesn't matter whether the product is new or old. You look at your situation and then choose a product. Just because there's an NFO or an IPO, you don't have to sign the check. You are not under the obligation. So I always use this kind of things. But yeah, tools would definitely go a long way.
Yeah, fantastic, Amit. And you always come with such a wonderful practical anecdotes.
Right.
Yeah, it's like this is a question coming from Girish. Request to share a note on bias, investment risk. Girish, a lot of things are available on the on the Google. You can search and do. But I'll try to get you something on on your, you also put LIC and DIP. That is just we are discussing and we will create. And there's a question coming next is Keyur Purohit. How do we understand, Dr. Kavita, you can take this question. How do we understand cognitive or emotional bias of a customer?
Okay, so so cognitive bias is basically it's to do with information processing. So suppose your client is not able to understand certain statistics, right? And then they make wrong decisions based on that. That's a kind of a cognitive bias, right? So it's simply because maybe they're not exposed to the world of investing, and they're not able to understand some key numbers which you communicate to them, right? So which means that they need to have more risk literacy or financial literacy, whatever you say, right? So that is what we call as a cognitive bias, right? So the other example I had given earlier in the talk was on anchoring, which is also an cognitive bias. So you have to basically tell them that no, you should not anchor. So this is not a salient piece of information which is going to help your investment, and hence there is no point anchoring on it. That's the whole idea, right? The emotional bias is something which comes because of feeling regret, right? So for example, you show your client that, oh, this is one mutual fund, these are 2-3 mutual funds to invest, and this could be the downside risk between all these 3 mutual funds, right? So, and if the client exhibits disappointment, right?
I think we have lost her.
Yeah, I think it's
Network issue. Yeah, while we await her
Hello?
comeback, she's back.
she's back.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. In between, we lost.
Okay, did you hear the cognitive bias?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So emotional bias is basically which comes out of regret, disappointment, the pain that people face because of losses. So all of us have a threshold. Below that threshold, we cannot face the loss. That is what is called this emotional bias.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Kavita. I think we may be running little out of the time, but I'll ask some questions. We may take few more questions. But Amitji, this question coming from Samir Dolakia, and Samir says long-term horizon definition changes from time to time, and by time to time, and fund managers do it. Why so? I don't think I agree on this, but I think you can answer it better.
And so my question to anybody who says that what is the definition of long term, my question to the person is, what do you expect as from the answer that I give? Are you looking for a time horizon beyond which your investment will always deliver positive returns? Are you asking for a time horizon beyond which you'll always get high returns? What are you seeking? What kind of answer are you seeking? And in most cases, people are looking at a time horizon where either the returns are better than fixed deposit over that period or at least positive. And then in that case, let me tell you, there is no such period known to mankind. There is not enough statistical data that beyond a certain period, there is a zero probability of making losses. What studies you've seen highlight that as you increase the time horizon, the probability of making losses keeps going down. The moment you increase the time horizon, the probability of beating other avenues goes up. And if I turn that around, it essentially means equity is not a good investment option for shorter periods. So if you have a shorter period, don't invest in equity. That's really the meaning of it, rather than looking at assurances. Again, it comes back to the certainty bias. There's no such thing. And if that's the case, somebody, and again, going back to what Kavita mentioned, somebody would say, I am okay for a 20% loss. Somebody would say, no, I only want 5% loss. I can't go beyond that. And the time horizon changes. Because if I'm ready for a 20% loss, a shorter time horizon may be okay with me. But if I am okay with only a 5% loss, then I'll have to go for that longer horizon. And because of that, the definition keeps changing. Believe me, there is no uniform definition uniformly accepted across the world as far as what is long term, except in the tax laws.
Yeah, income
And
tax.
Thank you.
even then, if you change the asset category, the definition of long term changes. For equity, fixed income, and real estate, the definitions are different.
Absolutely. This is also one of the biases most of us carry, right? It has to be fixed term. It is not the fixed
It
term
is
and
not.
what you look at. And earlier when she said about fantastic way, it's a goal-based portfolio, then that is a term where you can look at where your goals. I think a lot of great compliments for each, both of you, from many of them. And there is one interesting compliment for you, Amit ji. This is from Sunil Raghav. Trivedi ji, your voice is similar to Farhan Akhtar.
Okay, and there the similarity ends. He's a far more talented, far more handsome guy. So,
No, that's nice of him. And Sridhar Iyengar is asking, Sir, Rao sir needs more sessions. Yes, Sridhar ji, we would like to have a detailed workshop on this. It needs a lot. We are aware, like, and I requested Dr. Kavita ji and Amit ji, we will have a series of workshops and it's a pleasure to organize those things. And here is a question coming from Eldos Isaac. Can you please explain, Dr. Kavita, can you take this question, maybe a last question? Please explain choice architecture in clients interaction.
Okay, so let me give a very simple example. So suppose, children go to a cafeteria, right? And the food is displayed over there, right? So what do you expect, children to go and pick? They'll basically maybe go and pick muffins, or, they will basically pick food which is not so healthy, right? And which child will go and pick an apple, or, will go and pick an orange or something like that, right? So what choice architecture says is, so this basically comes from the fact that you cannot take away freedom of choice from people, but at the same time, you kind of nudge them so that they do the right, do the right things. So going back to the cafeteria, so suppose you can design a cafeteria where healthy food will be within eye level or within easy reach, right? And unhealthy food will be put somewhere, say, a bit far away or difficult to reach, right? Then at least you would believe that the first few times the child will go and kind of reach the healthy food, and maybe that will, the whole expectation is that that would become a habit, right? And then maybe, okay, they still know that there is unhealthy food. At some point of time when this becomes a habit, then they kind of make this assessment of what is good and what is bad, right? So I mean, that's the simplest example I can think of,
Yeah,
like
it's
choice.
a wonderful example. In fact, the choice architect, the way, like, you can provide how they can take a decision, and it's like you rightly put it, it's a availability. I mean, I was reading somewhere. This is again, I put it in my own mind, like. I always put it in the acronyms. I said this is a 3A.
oh,
Right.
You have availability, you have an anchoring, and you have an adjustment. When your entire choice architect happens between 3A,
super.
Right.
yeah, you
Very well
make it aware. That's a way to
So
look at.
incidentally, sir, Google partially uses this choice architecture. So the sponsored search results come at the top. And what comes on top, and majority of us don't go to the second or third page while doing Google search. So while Google says that there are millions of search options available, we end up in the first 10 or 15. Whatever we find is enough, and we don't go beyond that. So that's why the sponsored searches appear at the top. It's number one. Number two,
Right.
there is a research available in the United States where these talk with simpler company names tend to quote at a higher valuation compared to those with more complicated names. And it's weird, it is crazy, but there again, it's, if something is easier to pronounce, there is likely to be more trading volume and the stock commands a higher price. So what I would say is, going by this, is as an MFD or as an RIA, you look at your shortlist. You can also nudge it in a particular manner, that you say there are 40 schemes within this category, but this 5 are my in my shortlist. So you put it as my shortlist, the other funds, when you do a comparison. And people are likely to take notice of the first 5 first. And out of that, you say, but in your portfolio, we are only going to take 2 or 3 out of this 5. So let's sit together and decide. So you are actually not taking a decision on behalf of the client. You are helping the client pick up by even making the choice also easier by creating that shortlist. And these are some of the techniques that, and I picked up most of these things from some of the successful MFDs or RIAs, and they've been using it extensively.
Fabulous. Thanks, Amit ji. And it's typically the choice architect is like, as a financial advisor is a choice architect, and he or she got the responsibility to organize those contexts where the investor can take his investment decisions. That's what, I mean, for me, I call MFD today is making financial decisions. You are making someone to have a financial decisions. You are an MFD, right? And as an MFD, how you can architect, like as Amit said, these are the 5 product buckets. As Kavita said, these are the goal bucket. How we can match these, and so that it becomes easier for somebody to pick it up. I think that's where we can look at.
Just
And
one
here is
point, sorry, to just add, I mean, just to give completeness. So the nudge should not become a sludge. So there are a lot of risks. So like how Mr. Amit was saying that nudging is good, but if it is out of context and if you don't give them the freedom still, right, it becomes a sludge. So these are the different risks of also nudging. So I think that should also be carefully thought out.
fabulous, fabulous. Thank you so much. And Amit ji, this is the last one. I mean, Sunil Raghav ka question like can ye Hindi pustak mil sakta hai? Like request to provide a best book in the name and the read in Hindi and for the market to understand. अगर से पुस्तक नहीं तो आप एक पुस्तक लिखना पड़ेगा.
Okay, so riding the roller coaster is available in Hindi, but and then that talks a lot about behavioral. I mean, rather, I have not put it in the structured manner the way Kavita has put it. I've shared a lot of behavioral biases and stuff like that in the form of anecdotes and experiences that we come across. But that's one that's available. But on behavioral finance, I don't recollect if there is any other book available in Hindi. But let me just search for it, and we'll reach out through Prashant and pass on the information to Sunil ji.
Sure, sure. That's fantastic. I think there are a lot of compliments to you, Dr. Kavita. I mean, I know this is Shailendra says many thanks, sir, and Dr. Kavita for rich research-backed inputs. Yeah, friends, Dr. Kavita is a moving encyclopedia on behavioral finance, and whenever I speak, it's a volumes of research. It will come. We sincerely thank each one of you to be here. And before I conclude, probably one message from you, Dr. Kavita, for the audience on biases, emotions, anything?
No, actually, yeah, my message is that I think I think academia and industry should collaborate very importantly, because you as an industry, I think you have very good anecdotal evidences to back the kind of academic or rather, let me put it this way: for our academic research to become relevant, I think it's very important for us to collaborate.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, otherwise, this biases, if you go and open biases, like if you Google behavioral biases, there are more than 500 documented biases. So if a person sneezes, it's a bias. If a person coughs, it's a bias, right? So you need a structure there which an academia can bring to it, but the relevance and the input has to kind of come from the industry, right? So that both of them, so it becomes like a really good toolbox.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I think here is a request has come from Mukesh Chaudhani ji. Please take a full session on this subject, and nice session. And Mukesh ji, I'll promise and assure Dr. Kavita will be joining soon to have full session for us. We are going to trouble her more and more, and definitely we are going to invite you for that, and we look forward. And Amit ji, any message from you, the final message on this aspect today?
Well, you quoted Benjamin Graham. He's considered to be the father of investing. So I'll borrow from his line that an investor's chief problem and his worst enemy is likely to be himself. I would say it applies to advisors and MFDs also. Understand our own biases, understand the client's biases. But seeing somebody else's biases is far more easier than seeing our own biases. That's the message with which I will end. What to do and how to go about it? Well, using a pen and paper is probably the best tool to control our biases. Write down when you are taking decision, why did you take a decision, what was going on in the mind, and then hold yourself to it. Lot of times we decide on the fly, it remains in the mind for a while, and then that random access memory gets erased very soon. I mean, we don't really remember a lot of things unless pain is involved. So, and that pain comes in consequence. But at the time of decision making, we don't really remember for long. Why did we decide?
Absolutely. Keep everything in writing. It makes all that, even for managing your own emotions. If you start writing your own journal in the morning or journal in the evening, and that makes a lot, why you have taken the decision, what are your emotions. In fact, we always quote now, I think Benjamin Graham or Richard Thaler or Daniel Kahneman. But in Indian context, if we can go back to the ages, it's like, Patanjali Yoga Sutra, which talks about, how you can control your emotions with one statement, and the one it's one Yoga Sutra which talks about is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. In that, what it talks about is it's you have yama niyama, asana pranayama, those stuffs. In that, yama is how your relations with yourself and relations with others, and in the niyama is your own behavior in various contexts. And it's like, unfortunately we have not done that research. Probably we are a little biased on getting the latest, but I think we can go back and revisit when we are doing. And understanding emotions biases are the most important. And I keep always telling for the advisors or for any one of us, if you want to enhance your PBT, that is profit before tax, not exactly the profit before tax, your performance is always driven by your behavior, and your behavior is always driven by the emotions, and your emotions always driven by your thinking. You change your thinking, you change your emotions. You change your emotions, you change your behavior. You change your behavior, you change your performance. I think when we go to our investors, probably that PBT we need to remember is how we can get that. I think as an MFDs or every one of us, any of these professions, it is always we need to build our competency. And if we build this competency, our client acquisition and client engagement becomes better, and we become better advisors. And let us not be LIC biased. That is the loss aversion, the impatience, and conservatism. And there is one thing I call all the biases, the major biases in the financial world is it's like, it's called lock harm. LOCHA. It's the HAARM. LOC is, you have a loss aversion, you have it's overconfidence, and you have a confirmation. And these are, we need to brain our lock with this so that we will not have that aversions. And there is something harming us. That is, we have either herding mentality, or we have an anchoring psychology, or availability bias, or recency or representative bias, and we have a mental accounting. If we can understand biases are nothing wrong, you should understand the bias. Let not biases have you. You have the bias. Let not biases have you. That's what with which we conclude here, and wishing you all the good luck. And each of these biases will exist. All that we need to have is we need to have a will, how I can manage those and how I can get there. And then we can always part of that change, and we can do it. And we look forward for a next wonderful session with both of them, have a workshop separately. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Kavita for taking time out, and my good friend Amit Ji for always available to, there is no bias for us, he's always available. We are based for him, it's, and thanks. I'll invite Anita, and I thank Cafe Mutual for this platform. This is the first session to start with for this financial year. And friends, let me tell you a little bit on the selfish interest. Last year, that was the most turbulent year, thanks to my good friends, like even Dr. Kavita was many of the sessions, and Amit, we were there every week. At Aditya Birla, the Nipun Academy, which I handle, has done little over 464 webinars for MFDs, and we did covered 165,000 people. And we look forward, and I thank everyone for participating. And it's a pleasure to serve you all. And and wishing you all the good luck. Please do take care of your health and your and your loved ones. And there is a next week we have a Gudi Padwa and all the New Years. Wishing you all the New Year very best. Hopefully, right across, the virus has not gone away from the world, but fear is gone away little. Please keep little bit of fear, be biased, because you take care of yourself. And thank you so much for joining this evening. Thanks again to Kavita and Tavik. And over to you, Anita. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kavita and Amit. This was such a wonderful session. Thank you for sharing your rich knowledge and experience with us. I'm so glad. Thank you, Mr. Rao, for nudging us to do this particular topic and get both of you. The Jugalbandi was perfect. The kind of case studies, the examples that you all have stated have made this complex topic so easy to understand. I'm sure our audience is feeling much enriched and better equipped to handle their client interactions. So thank you so much to the audiences. I hope you've enjoyed it. I can see already from your messages how wonderful this session has been for you. And we will be sharing the recordings of this session shortly with you. So if you have any other questions, send in your queries to us. You can mail me at anita@cafemutual.com. Or of course, all these wonderful people are available to you. Thank you so much. Stay safe and have a great festive week ahead. Thank you so much.
So much. Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. God bless you all.